something is quietly changing in the world around you. You can feel it when you walk through the grocery store and notice the prices again. You can feel it when you look at your monthly budget and wonder where the money went. You can feel it in the back of your mind, that low, persistent hum of uncertainty that never quite goes away. Most people ignore that feeling. They tell themselves it will pass, that things will stabilize, that someone, somewhere, is handling it. But what if they are not? What if the most important decision you will ever make for your family is not a financial investment, not a career move, not even where you choose to live, but whether or not you know how to grow your own food? There is a group of people in America who have never asked that question. Not because they are wealthy, not because they have a stockpile of canned goods or a bunker underground, but because they never stopped doing what humans have done for thousands of years. They grow their food. They preserve it. They share it. And they do it with a level of skill, patience, and quiet confidence that most of the modern world has completely forgotten. I am talking about the Amish. And today, I am going to show you how to build a modern version of their garden system, a system so efficient, so sustainable, and so deeply practical that it can feed your family for free, season after season, year after year. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you are finding value in what I am sharing here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button, because it genuinely helps more people find this content. And stay with me until the very end of this video, because everything I share today builds on itself, and the final piece is the one that ties it all together in a way that will completely change how you think about your garden, your family, and your future. I promise you, the last few minutes will be worth every second of your time. Now, let me paint a picture for you. It is early morning in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The sun is just beginning to come up over the hills. A woman in a plain dress steps out of her farmhouse door with a basket over her arm. She walks to a garden that stretches out behind her home, neat rows of vegetables, beds of herbs, fruit trees along the fence line, and a deep compost pile in the corner that has been turning since before her children were born. She is not worried about supply chain disruptions. She is not anxious about inflation. She is not dependent on a trucking system, a refrigeration grid, or a corporation deciding whether to stock her local store. She is free. Not free in the way the word gets used in political speeches. Free in the most fundamental, physical, biological sense of the word. She can feed her family, no matter what happens beyond those fence lines. That kind of freedom did not come from luck, is less than #0. 5# is greater than #. It did not come from inheritance. It came from a system. A set of principles that have been passed down, refined, tested across generations, and proven to work even in the hardest of times. And here is what I find remarkable about that system. It is not complicated. It is not primitive. It is not out of reach for someone living in a suburb, on a small plot of land, or even in a modest backyard. What makes it powerful is not its scale. What makes it powerful is its logic. We live in an era that has made food production invisible. Think about that for a moment. For the vast majority of human history, every person on Earth had a direct, personal relationship with the food they ate. They planted it. They tended it. They harvested it. They preserved it. They understood intimately what the soil needed, what the weather was doing, and what their family would eat in January based on what they grew in July. Then, in the span of just a few generations, we handed all of that knowledge, all of that power, to a global industrial system. and most of us did it without even noticing. We traded self-sufficiency for convenience. And for a long time, that trade felt like a good deal. But the bill is coming due. Food prices have risen faster in the last 5 years than in any comparable period in recent memory. Grocery store shelves that once seemed endlessly reliable have shown us more than once that they are not. Extreme weather events are disrupting harvests across entire continents. And the fertilizers, fuels, and chemicals that modern industrial agriculture depends on are themselves tied to supply chains that are increasingly fragile. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it because the Amish figured this out a long time ago, not by predicting the future, but by refusing to forget the past. And their garden is the living proof of that wisdom. This is crucial. What you are about to learn is not a hobby. It is not a weekend project. It is a fundamental life skill, one that human beings practiced for 10,000 years before we forgot it in the last 50. And the beautiful thing is this: once you learn it, once you build it, it becomes one of the most stable and reliable systems in your life. It costs almost nothing to maintain. It gives back more than you put in. And it gets better every single year. Let us start at the very beginning. The first principle of the modern Amish garden is this: the soil is not a surface, it is a living system. Most people who try to grow a garden and fail make the same mistake. They think of soil as dirt, as a passive medium that holds plants in place while you pour nutrients on them from a bag. That is not soil. That is a container. And growing in a container is always a fight, because the moment you stop adding inputs, the system collapses. Real soil, living soil, is something entirely different. It is an ecosystem. A single tablespoon of healthy garden soil contains more living organisms than there are people on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, all of them working together in a web of relationships so complex and so finely tuned that no laboratory has ever fully replicated it. And the Amish have always known this. Not because they studied microbiology, but because they watched what happened when they took care of their soil and what happened when they did not. The cornerstone of Amish soil management is compost. Not the bag of composted material from the garden center. A real, living, continuously active compost system that sits at the heart of the garden like an engine room. Think of your compost pile as a solar-powered food factory. You feed it kitchen scraps, garden trimmings, straw, leaves, animal manure, if you have access to it. You give it air and occasional moisture. And it converts all of that raw waste into the richest, most biologically active growing medium on the planet. For free. Continuously. Year after year. Most people never realize this, but a well-maintained compost system eliminates the need to ever purchase fertilizer again. Every nutrient your plants need, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, trace minerals, beneficial microorganisms, all of it is produced right there in that pile. The Amish do not buy fertility. They grow it. To build this system for your own garden, you do not need a large space. You need 3 things: a place to accumulate green material, a place to accumulate brown material, and the patience to let biology do its work. Green materials are your nitrogen sources, kitchen scraps, grass clippings, fresh plant trimmings, coffee grounds. Brown materials are your carbon sources, dry leaves, cardboard, straw, wood chips. The ratio matters. Think of it like a fire. Too much green, and it smothers itself. It gets wet, anaerobic, and it smells. Too much brown and it burns cold. It just sits there, barely decomposing, The right balance, roughly 2 parts brown to 1 part green, and the pile heats up, breaks down, and produces finished compost in as little as 6 to 8 weeks. Start this pile today. Not next spring. Not when you have everything figured out. Today. Because the soil you are building now is the harvest you will eat in 2 years. The second principle is this: a garden is not a collection of plants, it is a community. This is one of the most profound shifts in thinking that separates an Amish garden from a conventional one, and it has a name in modern permaculture and ecological gardening: companion planting. But the Amish have been doing it for generations without needing to name it. They simply observed what grew well together, what protected each other, what helped each other thrive. The most famous example is something called the Three Sisters, a planting method used by indigenous peoples of North America that the Amish adopted and refined. Corn, beans, and squash, planted together, in the same bed, at the same time. Here is why this is genius. The corn grows tall and provides a structure for the beans to climb, eliminating the need for stakes or trellises. The beans fix nitrogen from the air directly into the soil, feeding the corn and the squash. The squash spreads its broad leaves along the ground, shading out weeds and sealing moisture into the soil, reducing the need to water. 3 plants. 3 problems solved. No chemicals. No tools. No cost. Stay with me, because this part is important. The companion planting principle goes far beyond the Three Sisters. It is a philosophy that says every plant in your garden should be doing more than one job. Some plants deter pests. Marigolds planted along the borders of a vegetable bed release a scent that repels aphids, nematodes, and even some beetles. Basil planted near tomatoes improves the flavor of the tomatoes and confuses the insects that would otherwise lay eggs on the leaves. Nasturtiums act as a trap crop. They attract aphids away from your food plants and concentrate them where you can deal with them easily. What the Amish understood is that nature, left to its own logic, always moves toward diversity. Monocultures, single crops planted in massive fields, are a human invention. They are efficient for machines, but fragile for ecosystems. A diverse garden, where many different plants are growing together, is far more resistant to disease, to pests, to drought, and to failure than any single crop system. It mirrors the way a forest works. And forests do not need fertilizer. They do not need pesticides. They feed themselves. The third principle is one that surprises people the most, and yet it is perhaps the most valuable of all. Seeds are not a product. Seeds are a library. Every spring, millions of people drive to their garden center and buy seed packets. Every year, the same packets, the same varieties, spending money they do not have to replicate a cycle that never ends. This is not how the Amish operate, and it is not how your great-grandparents operated either. The Amish save seeds, not as a hobby or a nostalgic practice, but as a fundamental act of agricultural independence. When the harvest comes in, they do not eat every last tomato, every last pepper, every last bean. They set some aside. They let them fully ripen to the point of seed maturity. They dry those seeds carefully. They store them in cool, dry, dark conditions. And the following spring, they plant them again. The result, over time, is a seed collection perfectly adapted to your specific soil, your specific climate, and your specific growing conditions. These are called heirloom varieties. Open-pollinated plants whose seeds breed true, meaning the plant that grows from a saved seed looks and tastes and produces exactly like the parent plant. Unlike most commercially sold hybrid seeds, which are engineered to be sterile or to produce inferior offspring, heirloom seeds are alive, generative, and self-perpetuating. Think about what that means for a moment. One tomato plant, allowed to set seed, can produce hundreds of seeds. Those seeds, properly stored, remain viable for 5 to 10 years. Each of those seeds can grow into a plant that produces dozens more tomatoes and hundreds more seeds. From a single fruit, in a single season, you have the potential to generate enough tomato seeds to feed a neighborhood for years. For free. Forever. This is the kind of thinking that the modern food system has spent decades trying to make you forget. Because a gardener who saves seeds is a gardener who never needs to buy seeds again. And that gardener is free. To begin saving seeds, start with the easiest crops: tomatoes, beans, peas, squash, and peppers. These are all self-pollinating, meaning they do not require complex isolation techniques to produce true breeding offspring. Harvest seeds from your most vigorous, most productive, most disease-resistant plants. Not the biggest fruits. The best plants. Rinse them. Dry them on a paper plate in a warm, ventilated space for 2 to 3 weeks. Store them in labeled paper envelopes inside an airtight glass jar with a small packet of silica gel to absorb moisture. Keep the jar in a cool, dark drawer. That is it. That is the entire system. And it costs almost nothing. The fourth principle brings us into territory that most modern gardeners have completely abandoned, and yet it is the difference between a garden that barely survives the year and one that feeds you through every season. That principle is preservation. The Amish do not think of the garden as a summer activity. They think of the garden as a year-round food supply. And the bridge between summer's abundance and winter's scarcity is preservation to the art and science of capturing food at its peak and extending it far beyond the moment it was harvested. Here is a truth that most modern people have lost touch with. The garden does not produce food evenly across the year. In midsummer, a well-planted garden will produce far more food than any single family can eat fresh. Zucchini that seem to double in size overnight. Tomatoes ripening by the basketful. Beans hanging thick on every stem. The instinct of the modern gardener is to give it away, let it rot, or feel overwhelmed. The instinct of the Amish gardener is to preserve every last bit of it. The Amish use 4 primary preservation methods, and together they create a food security net that is extraordinary in its completeness. The first is canning water bath canning for high-acid foods like tomatoes, fruits, and pickles, and pressure canning for low-acid foods like beans, corn, and meat. A single afternoon of canning 20 jars of tomato sauce represents 20 future meals, sitting safely on a shelf, requiring no refrigeration, no electricity, and no further cost. The shelf life of properly canned food is 1 to 5 years. Some last even longer. The second method is fermentation, one of the oldest, simplest, and most nutritionally powerful preservation techniques in human history. Lacto-fermented vegetables like sauerkraut, kimchi, and pickles do not just last for months without refrigeration. They actually become more nutritious over time as beneficial bacteria multiply and pre-digest the food, making it easier to absorb. A head of cabbage and a handful of salt, packed into a jar and left at room temperature for a week, becomes a probiotic-rich food that will last for a year or more in a cool cellar. The Amish have known this for generations. Modern science has spent decades confirming it. The third preservation method is drying, one of the most energy-efficient and space-efficient ways to store food. Herbs, beans, corn, tomatoes, peppers, fruit, all of them can be dried and stored in a fraction of the space they occupied, fresh and rehydrated months later with nothing but water. An Amish pantry often contains strings of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars of dried beans and corn lining the shelves, and bags of dried fruit that were plentiful in summer and precious in winter. You do not need a dehydrator to do this. A warm room, good air circulation, and a week of patience will dry most herbs and thin-sliced vegetables more gently and more effectively than any machine. The fourth method is root cellaring, storing fresh produce in cool, dark, humid conditions where it can last for months without any processing at all. Potatoes, carrots, beets, onions, garlic, winter squash, apples, all of these can be stored for 3, 4, even 6 months in a root cellar. And a root cellar does not have to be elaborate. A corner of a cool basement, an insulated box buried in the ground, even a well-ventilated garage in a temperate climate can serve this function. The goal is simply to mimic the conditions of the earth itself: cool, dark, and moderately humid. Together, these 4 methods create something remarkable. They create a garden that does not end in October. A garden that feeds your family in December and February and April from the same effort you put in during June and July. This is the Amish model. Not a summer project, but a year-round system. And once you experience your first winter eating almost entirely from food you grew and preserved yourself, something shifts inside you that is very hard to explain and almost impossible to reverse. The fifth principle is one that the modern world has largely reduced to a metaphor, but that the Amish practice as a literal, physical reality. Community is infrastructure. In the Amish tradition, no family gardens entirely alone. Neighbors share seeds, share labor, share knowledge, and share abundance. When someone is sick or overwhelmed, the community steps in to help with the harvest. When someone has an excess of one crop, they trade or give freely, knowing that their own surplus will be someone else's lifeline in a different season. This is not charity. This is not sentiment. This is a practical, rational system for managing the inevitable variability of growing food. Because here is the truth about gardens: they do not always cooperate. Some years, your tomatoes explode with abundance and your squash fails. Some years, your beans barely set and your neighbor's beans fill every basket. A community of gardeners, each growing slightly different things in slightly different conditions, is far more food secure than any individual gardener operating alone, no matter how skilled. Most people never realize this, but the return of community food networks in modern neighborhoods, seed swaps, community gardens, food sharing groups, cooperative canning days, is not a trendy lifestyle choice. It is a rediscovery of something that kept human communities alive through every famine, every drought, and every economic collapse in history. You do not need to join an Amish community to build this kind of network. You need a neighbor, a conversation, a bag of extra seeds offered over a fence, a jar of pickles left on a doorstep. These small acts are the seeds of something much larger, and they grow the same way gardens do, slowly at first, and then, suddenly, with a momentum that surprises everyone. The sixth and final principle ties everything together, and it is the one that separates a gardener who struggles every year from one who flourishes. That principle is observation. Relentless, patient, humble observation. The Amish do not follow gardening trends. They do not buy the latest soil amendment or the newest cultivar every season. They watch. They watch which plants thrive in which part of the garden and which ones consistently struggle. They watch where the water pools after rain and where it drains fastest. They watch which insects appear at which time of year and what they do. They watch the soil, its color, its texture, its smell, and they read it the way a doctor reads a patient. And they write it down. Every Amish gardener keeps records. Not elaborate databases or complex spreadsheets. A simple notebook. What was planted where? What the weather did? What yielded and what failed? What the first frost date was? What variety of bean did best in that heavy clay corner by the fence? These notes are consulted year after year, refined and annotated, and passed down to the next generation as something more valuable than money. They are the accumulated intelligence of a family's relationship with a specific piece of land. A modern garden journal does not need to be more complex than a spiral notebook with dated entries. But the habit of keeping one will transform your gardening faster than any tool, any technique, or any product you will ever buy. Because the garden is not a static system. It changes every year. It responds to what you did last year. It accumulates the effects of your decisions over time. And without records, you are starting from zero every spring. With records every spring, you are a little wiser, a little more prepared, and a little more in tune with the living system you are tending. Now, I want to bring all of these principles together into a picture of what a modern Amish garden actually looks like in practice. Because I want you to be able to close your eyes and see it. Feel how possible it is. And understand exactly what steps to take to begin. Imagine a backyard. Not a large one. An ordinary suburban backyard, perhaps 30 by 40 feet. In the back corner, there is a compost area, 2 or 3 simple bins made from pallets or wire mesh. They are always working. One bin receiving fresh material, one bin actively decomposing, one bin full of finished compost ready to be spread. Along the south-facing fence, there is a row of tall crops, sunflowers, pole beans climbing, simple teepee trellises, perhaps a few rows of corn. In front of them, the main growing beds raised slightly, loosely mounded, never compacted by foot traffic. Each bed holds a community of plants, tomatoes with basil at their feet and marigolds at the border. Squash spreading across the paths, shading the ground. Lettuces and spinach tucked in wherever there is shade in the afternoon. Brassicas, broccoli, cabbage, kale set out for the fall garden just as the summer crops are winding down. Along one side of the house, there is a small herb garden, rosemary, thyme, oregano, sage, lavender. Perennial herbs that come back every year without replanting, providing flavor, medicine, and insect habitat with no effort at all once established, is less than #0. 5 hashes greater than. A rain barrel sits under the downspout from the gutters, collecting water that falls for free from the sky. A small fruit tree or two, perhaps an apple and a pear, stand at the corners of the property, underplanted with comfrey, a deep-rooted herb that mines minerals from the subsoil and drops them as a natural fertilizer when its leaves are cut. Inside the house, the pantry tells the story of the garden's abundance. Rows of gleaming canning jars on sturdy shelves, tomatoes, green beans, salsa, jam, pickled cucumbers, fermented sauerkraut, braids of dried onions and garlic hanging from a hook, jars of dried herbs, a basket of winter squash on the cool pantry floor, a box of potatoes in the coolest corner of the basement, a drawer of labeled seed envelopes, each one representing next year's garden, next year's harvest, next year's security. This is not a fantasy. This is not a scene from a different century or a different world. This is achievable. In your backyard, with your hands, starting this year. And the investment required is not money. It is attention, time, and the willingness to begin before you feel fully ready. Because here is the truth that very few people want to hear, but everyone needs to understand. There is no perfect moment to start growing your own food. There is no season when the soil is ideally prepared. The seeds are exactly right, your schedule is clear, and the learning curve feels manageable. The Amish did not wait for perfect conditions. They started with whatever ground they had, whatever seeds they could find, and whatever knowledge they had inherited or could teach themselves. And they made mistakes. Crops failed. Pests appeared. Droughts came. Floods came. And they kept going. Because the alternative dependence was not something they were willing to accept. That choice, the choice to be a producer rather than only a consumer, is one of the most quietly revolutionary things a person can do in the modern world. It changes your relationship with money, because you need less of it for food. It changes your relationship with your body, because you are eating food that is genuinely fresh and genuinely alive. It changes your relationship with your children, who learn in the garden that food comes from the earth and not from a package, and that patience and care are rewarded in ways that screens never can be. It changes your relationship with time, because the garden teaches you to think in seasons rather than days, in years rather than quarters, in cycles rather than deadlines. And perhaps most importantly, it changes your relationship with fear. That low, persistent hum of uncertainty that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. The anxiety that comes from knowing that your family's food supply depends entirely on systems you cannot see, control, or predict. The garden does not eliminate uncertainty, but it gives you something to do about it. Something real. Something physical. Something that gets better every year. I want to leave you with one final thought. 100 years ago, most families in the Western world grew at least some of their own food. It was not considered unusual. It was not considered extreme. It was simply what people did. It was part of being alive, part of being responsible, part of being an adult in a world that had not yet convinced itself that the supermarket would always be there. We have spent a century forgetting that knowledge. And in the process, we have made ourselves more comfortable and more vulnerable at the same time. More comfortable because the food is always there, clean and packaged, and convenient. More vulnerable because we have no idea how it got there, who controls it, or what happens if it does not. The Amish never forgot. And what I am suggesting, gently but seriously, is that it is time for us to remember. Not to abandon the modern world. Not to move to a farm or renounce technology. But to recover the most fundamental skill of human civilization, the ability to grow food and integrate it back into our lives in whatever form our land, our time, and our circumstances allow. A single raised bed. A pot of tomatoes on a balcony. A corner of a lawn converted to vegetable growing. A shelf of canning jars in a basement. A bag of saved seeds in a drawer. These are not small things. It is less than #0. 5# is greater than they are the beginning of something large. They are the first steps of a journey that gets easier and more rewarding with every season. And they are acts of faith, faith that the future is worth preparing for, that your family is worth feeding well, and that the knowledge of those who came before us is worth carrying forward. The Amish woman with her basket in the early morning light is not a relic of the past. She is a portrait of resilience. She is showing us something we already know, deep in the oldest part of our human instincts, that to grow food is to be free. And freedom, real freedom, is always worth the effort. If this video has spoken to you, if something in these words has lit a small fire of determination somewhere inside you, I ask you to do one thing before you close this screen. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Right now. Make a decision about what your first step will be. 1 seed packet ordered. one compost bin started. One corner of the yard dug up and turned. One jar of dried herbs labeled and put on the shelf. One decision made today. Because that is how every garden in history has begun. Not with a plan, not with a perfect system, with a single act of intention. With the quiet, firm decision that this year, things will be different. Please subscribe to this channel if you want to continue this journey with me. We cover everything from soil building to seed saving to seasonal preservation, all of it grounded in the same principles you heard today: practicality, independence, and long-term thinking. Share this video with someone you care about. A neighbor, a family member, a friend who has been thinking about starting a garden but has not yet found the push they needed. This video might be that push. And leave a comment below. Tell me where you are in your gardening journey. Are you just starting? Have you been growing food for years? Is there a specific part of the system, the soil, the seeds, the preservation, the community that resonates most strongly with you right now? I read every comment. And the conversations that happen in this community are some of the most valuable things I have encountered in years of making this content. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching until the end. And thank you for caring enough about your family's future to spend an hour with a garden and the people who never stop believing in it. Now go plant something.